Please, on your way out or at some point during the proceedings, feel free to give us your contact information. We'll be happy to include you, and we promise not to spam you, okay? I'm going to turn it over to Ben Wittes, Brookings, Lawfare. I don't know how many other great achievements he has, but he's our host today, MC. Ben?
Thanks very much. So thanks, Mike, for hosting us today. And thanks to you all for coming. So this event had its genesis when I got a phone call sometime back from David Hoffman, who will be, does this mic work too, yeah? On our panel today. And David had read a book that Gabby Bloom and I had written about the future of violence. And he pointed out to me in ways that I'll discuss a little bit later that this, the argument that we made in this book had some really interesting common themes with some stuff that Intel and Intel Security were trying to do, specifically related to the idea of defense as a very distributed function and security as a highly distributed good, whereas we tend to think of it as a very centralized good. So David and I got to talking about this and over a fairly protracted period of time. And the result is this event, which I just want to sort of sketch out a little bit what we're going to do today, and then just dive in and do it. So the question is big data, data analytics, and data gathering and use inherently, as we often think of it, a privacy risk? Is it necessary to protect privacy and security, or are there significant elements of both? Is it kind of something that you have to do if you're going to protect security and privacy in a modern context, but you also have to do it right, or you itself cause a threat to those values? And so what we decided to do was have Chris Young of Intel Security give a talk to start on this theme and this question, and the way data does and doesn't get used in cyber defense. And then to kind of have an argument about it and have a discussion about it among a group of people of pretty diverse orientations on the subject. So we're going to start with a talk from Chris Young, and then we will, without a break, move directly into a panel. The panel is right up front here, so when Chris is done, they will just come up, and we will start right away. I'm going to do introductions now so that we do not have to pause and spend a lot of time introducing ourselves later. Let me do the panel first, and then come back to our keynote speaker. So the panel involves, actually, let me take that back. I will introduce the panel when you can actually see their faces. So let me introduce our speaker. Chris Young is the general manager of the Intel Security Group. A lot of you know of McAfee. Intel Security is McAfee, or vice versa. I'm not sure which is the right way to say that now. But so Young leads Intel's security business across both hardware and software platforms, including McAfee and Intel's other security assets. It's a more than $3 billion revenue business. Prior to joining Intel, he was senior vice president at Cisco Security Business Group, where he was responsible for strategy, engineering, and product development for the company's global security businesses. So please join me in welcoming him. And as I say, the panel will convene immediately after his talk. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for first of all, thanks for including me in your discussion today. It's an important topic that we face. there's a lot of dialogue going on between the public sector and the private sector about these issues of privacy versus security. And it's, I have a pretty easy answer from my perspective on the question, and it's that you do need both. You do need security and privacy to coexist. In some ways, I would argue that without good security, you really can't guarantee or begin to guarantee good privacy. I think it's very important. Certainly if you look at, one of the technology areas that's in the eye of the public discourse today around encryption, you can't have good privacy without encryption, nor can you have good security without it either. You've got to have it operate in both ways. So certainly there is quite a bit of work to be done. But what we have found, even in the encryption debates, is that at times the two can be at odds with one another. Sometimes your need for security and to investigation to deliver good security puts pressure on the privacy aspect of things, and sometimes the need or the desire for good privacy is a challenge to achieve the security mission. And so I think that discussion is important for us as we think about how to ultimately deliver on both aspects of what we're trying to do. As a practitioner, there are a few things that I would share with you just on the broader landscape that I think are incredibly important to kind of help maybe shape some of the nature of how we think about these topics. Number one, broadly speaking, we're in a massive paradigm shift from an IT perspective, from a technology perspective. You hear a lot about the Internet of Things. For those of you who aren't technical, some of you who are more technical probably are part of the Internet of Things transformation that we're happening. But if you think about it this way, most of us traditionally have, when we kind of think about computing, you go to your computer, you're doing something on that machine. But in today's world, we're moving to a paradigm where computing is something that happens all the time. You compute without thinking. And it's important to keep that in mind because we're bringing compute power, we're connecting physical spaces, our physical lives, our homes in some cases, our bodies through wearables. I was in some buildings in the Washington, D.C. area the last couple of days, and they have signs on the doors that say, don't bring Bluetooth devices into the building. And my joke with some of these guys is, well, what are you going to do when my jacket has an embedded Bluetooth capability because I'm trying to monitor my heart rate all day long, or the number, I'm not wearing a Fitbit or a watch to count my number of steps, but it's inherent in, it's built into my shoes, by whoever I get my shoes from. So, in that world, it's going to completely change the way we're going to have to think about managing security. And that's happening, across the board. When you think about the manufacturing spaces, you think about the next generation soldier that we want to put on the battlefield. He or she will have, probably hundreds of sensors to monitor them in many, many different ways. So that's a massive change in the IT space, and it's affecting all of us: consumers, businesses, the government, you name it. Everyone is part of this trend. On top of that, you have a massive change in the attack landscape as well. Two things I'll say about that. One big stat that stands out for me is if I go back 10 years, McAfee Labs, it's our group of men and women globally who study and who build intelligence around attacks, malware. It used to be viruses and that sort of thing. 10 years ago, we saw on average about 25 new threats or new variants of malware a day, not to be overly technical about it. Today, about 10 years later, we see over 500,000 new threats a day. So the exponential increase in the number, types, and variances of the attacks that are coming in our direction put a burden on those who would need to defend, consumers, businesses, government entities alike, is exponentially more challenging than it's ever been. And that's only going up and to the right, unfortunately. I will tell you some of the other things that we see in the space: a lot more attacks on mobile devices. So as we bring devices closer to our, again, to the types of things that we carry around with us every day, the attacks are following that trend. Ransomware. One of hopefully no one in this audience has had the privilege of being the victim of a ransomware attack. But just in short, I'll tell you what that means if you're not familiar with it. In today's world, you can get malware through an email or through clicking on the wrong web link. It can install itself on your machine. It can install itself in an organization's machines and start to encrypt the files either on the machine or in your data center. And then the attacker will ask you for a payment to release the encrypted data back to you. So they don't have to steal any information out of your organization. They don't have to take it from you. They leave it where it is, and they just make it impossible for you to get access to it, leveraging encryption. They'll ask you to pay them in Bitcoin, so they cannot be tracked by the government or anyone who's able to track financial payments through our legitimate payment systems. And that's a big challenge because it's, as my CTO would tell you, he thinks it's almost a perfect crime because it's easy to monetize, hard to trace, and it turns pretty much everyone into a victim, a potential victim. One of the things I have said is, what are we going to do in a world where we've got connected vehicles and you can't start your car in the morning because you've got ransomware on it? And somebody's going to ask you to pay them in order for you to be able to drive to work. That's not happened today. I don't know of an example of that today, but I can certainly see that potential in the future when we look at the combination of bringing compute and connectivity into our physical space and the trends that we see in malware. And so that's something we have to think about as well because if we're paying attention to the way things have been happening in cybersecurity, and I will tell you, the last 5 years we've been very focused on data breaches and information being stolen from individuals, from organizations. The world's already moving on to other forms of attacks. And we have to anticipate that as we start to think about not what should the policies be for the things that we've been focused on the last 5 years, but what do the policies need to look like for the next 5, 10, or even 15. That's a tough question for us to all focus on, but it's certainly something we have to think about. So one of the things that I would tell you to, if you kind of take all that in the backdrop, one of the other pieces of this is that there's not enough talented men and women in the cybersecurity industry to even deal with the problem. So we actually have a talent shortage that exacerbates this issue from an organizational perspective. Everyone, whether you're in the public sector or private sector, is scrambling to find enough people to deal with the defensive requirements that we all have. That just makes the challenge even harder, and it's something that we need to think about. As we need to think about as we make sure we don't make it harder for the few good people that we do have to get their jobs done and to ultimately defend us. So what are some of the things that are happening in the industry to deal with these problems, and how does that relate to some of the debate and some of the discussion that we're going to have here today? Number one is there is a movement towards more automation of the technology element to this. So as we gather information, we're leveraging tools and techniques. Big data analytics is one that comes up. I will tell you, I walk into a lot of meetings often and people say, well, what's your big data security thing that you've got? And I say, well, if somebody's selling you big data security, they haven't really sold you anything. What you're really trying to get to is an outcome. And yes, a technique or a tool that one might use is big data and the usage of big data to come up with answers to questions. Is this an attack or is it not? Is it legitimate? Where is it coming from? Have I seen it elsewhere in my environment? And these are the kinds of questions that we need to answer. So we do use these kinds of tools, and many organizations are trying to figure out ways they can automate their responses, but trying to do so through getting smarter at the beginning at identifying attacks and making sure that they've got the right ability to respond. Now, as we use those kinds of tools, we are needing to look, and in order to make big data leverageable from a cybersecurity perspective, you have to give it context. You need to understand more things about users, their devices, the information, the applications they're interacting with, where they might be located at a given point in time. And you can start to see where the request for or the requirement for more context around a given set of incidents or users starts to put you in a position where you need to ask questions or understand information that in some contexts could be considered private. And so there's a perfect example of, in order for us to get better at delivering on the security mission, to automate our defenses, to make them more intelligent, leveraging new types of tools, we are going to have to start to ask questions and think about what are the elements of privacy that need to be protected as we seek to process that information to get to the right answers, and really importantly, get to those answers quickly and give ourselves the ability to respond in an automated way, because we can't rely on investigators and people getting involved whenever there's an incident. They just won't scale. If you think about my 25 to 500,000 number of threats per day, we can't throw enough bodies at this problem. We've really got to have ways to automate it. So we do need to think about what are ways as we collect data that we can obfuscate the elements of that information that are private, but collect the right types of information such that we can make good decisions from a security perspective. What are ways in which we want to think about identity? Because I think that's a really, really important element of privacy. But identity matters a lot when you're making a decision around whether something should or shouldn't be happening in an environment, whether some piece of information should or shouldn't be accessed. One of the things about ransomware that makes it really, really challenging is encrypting files is a normal function on a machine. Most of you probably have security policies on your machine where you're encrypting data so it doesn't get stolen by someone else. So to see an application that's encrypting information on a machine doesn't necessarily trigger security products to spring into action, which is one of the reasons why ransomware is difficult to see. But if you understand the context of what's being encrypted, why is it being encrypted, when is it being encrypted, then you can start to answer the question of, okay, is this ransomware or is this a legitimate protection mechanism that's operating on the device? From a skills gap perspective, and I believe this is really important, there's a lot of work that's happening from a training perspective. I see organizations like SANS, certainly in the Department of Homeland Security, through the Cyber Corps, the CNEP, there's now been funding for a Cyber Corps. Intel Security, a number of our colleagues around the industry are all investing now much more heavily at the college level, at the university level, in trying to train more people, to get more people interested and qualified to come and operate in the cybersecurity environment. And I think this is important because if we can make an impact on the talent shortage, it's going to give us some opportunities to really work on the problems that matter the most and ultimately alleviate some of the pressure that we've got on us now. Because to some degree, what you might find from an investigator who says, I need this list of information if I'm investigating an incident. Part of the reason they're going to go for more information than they might need is because they're overstretched on their immediate role. So if we can actually take some of the pressure out of that system by getting the talent shortage under control, we'll be in a situation where we can drive more targeted approaches to solving the problem. And being specific and being focused in information that we seek, in context that we seek, and how we go about the actual mission of delivering security, it's very important. And I think ultimately can help us better serve the demands of the privacy element to these things. In fact, I would tell you that in some of the conversations that happen around encryption, part of the conversation does need to happen around specifically what are you trying to achieve in any given case, in any given situation. And I think being specific is our friend in these cases, and I think having more capability, more people who can go after this problem, who can alleviate some of the pressure that we've got in the system today, will enable us to do a better job of ultimately protecting privacy and ultimately getting after these problems the way we need to do so. The other thing I'll share is the need for more threat intelligence and more threat intelligence sharing between and among organizations, whether that be within the private sector, so organization to organization, between the private sector and the public sector, and even frankly within the public sector, because I know that across government we don't always share information or threat intelligence at the pace or with the degree of depth that we should. And one of the initiatives that Intel Security has been a part of for a few years now is something called the Cyber Threat Alliance. We've partnered with our competitors, actually, Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, amongst the founding body of the Cyber Threat Alliance. And we've worked together for a few years to really try to get at ways in which competitive organizations can actually share information to improve our posture in the overall mission of threat defense on behalf of our customers. And I'll tell you, we spent some time in the very beginning of this effort looking at, sort of approaching threat intelligence sharing, I think the way it's been approached, generally speaking, in this space for a while, where, the expectation is if we're going to share threat intelligence, let me show up with my boatload of threat intelligence, you come with yours, put it all together, and if we look at it hard enough, we'll be smarter on the problem. And I think what we learned in that process is that that's not how it's going to work at all. Like just sharing large elements of data, large data sets doesn't necessarily work very well at all. What we did do about a year ago is we said we're going to turn that model on its head a little bit and go at this problem differently because we think we can get a better answer if we do that. So what we did is we decided to move our efforts towards a very focused campaign. We said, let's pick a campaign, let's pick a subject, build a hypothesis around it, and then go after and take our collective threat knowledge to enrich our understanding of this given campaign or this given topic. We did that last year. We did that for the Crypto Wall 3 campaign. It is one of the campaigns in what I would call the family of ransomware. There are many, many different types of ransomware that are out there. Crypto Wall 3 is one example. We did that, and I will tell you we found a lot of good success. What we found is that each organization, even though many of us operate sort of across many different countries, we all service a lot of large as well as small and medium organizations. Some of us have consumer businesses as well. We each had actually unique threat intelligence to contribute to our understanding and knowledge around Crypto Wall 3. Published a white paper. We published the IOCs, made that information available to the industry. The day after we published the paper, we saw the attackers move to Crypto Wall 4. So we know we had an impact on their desire to continue to use the tool set that we made the industry broadly more effective at dealing with because of the work that we had done to collaborate around threat intelligence in this particular campaign. And I thought we got some important learnings around that. Number one, if you're going to do threat intelligence sharing, it's got to be around a focused set of topics. That's critically important. You can't just say, let's show up and share everything that we've got, or you'll just never get to an answer. Second problem with just showing up and sharing everything you've got is that organizations are always going to be sensitive to the free rider problem. We do have an industry out there. Each of us has different missions in some regard, depending upon what organization you might be a part of. So you're always going to be a bit sensitive around just giving that information that you've worked hard for to someone else to take and use for their own gain, maybe take credit for in some regard. We do have to remember that the men and women who do this work are human beings. They do care about their own personal achievements, and we do need to take that into account as we think about threat intelligence sharing. So our view is that we can actually if we go after focused topics, but also deliver on a mechanism that allows us to share threat intelligence and score the relative contributions of individuals or organizations who do so, you can more effectively collaborate between and among different players. I'll give you a good example of this is that, large companies, so like Intel Security, for example, we have lots of threat intelligence. We might be able to contribute a lot of information on a given subject, but some smaller organization might know a lot about a very discrete topic. And our ability to marry up those two sets of broad-based knowledge versus very deep knowledge is certainly valuable at the researcher, could be very valuable at the campaign level. And having a platform that allows us to share threat intelligence and allow researchers, allow individuals to score one another, almost if you might think about it the way you score and evaluate people who buy and sell and trade on exchanges like eBay. So you can actually know who you're dealing with when you approach them and vice versa. And we think that's a very effective way of starting to actually get to a productive threat intelligence sharing model. The other learning that we got from this is that you really need an automation mechanism. You know, a lot of the protocol, really the formats that exist today for threat intelligence sharing are still very based on an expectation that you're going to have a human being that's using that information. And so we believe the automation of this, being able to actually, send information to somebody in a digital format is much more important than, sharing spreadsheets and sharing databases of information. We've got to be able to push, in real time intelligence and knowledge so that we can move it and turn it into countermeasures very quickly. And I think if we do this effectively, you never get out of the business or out of the need for collecting threat intelligence and for enriching it, because there's a process of enrichment that you can go through ultimately before you deliver a mitigation or a block of an attack or an identification or a detection of a given attack that's happening in an organization. And if we can find good ways to share threat intelligence at the front end of that process when it's less valuable, but then make sure that we focus our value add, whether you're a security vendor or whether you operate as a defender of an organization, public or private sector, you can still add value while sharing good threat intelligence up front to make us all smarter. It's a little bit about raising the waterline here so that we can get better at that kind of thin end of the funnel, if you will. And I think that we have a real opportunity to do that if we approach this in the right way. And our example, our experience through working with the Cyber Threat Alliance, we believe, is one model for how that can work. Over and above what we see, I think, which are some pretty successful models in industry forums like the ISACs, for example, do a decent job of this. Although I would argue that to some degree, there's still a bit of some organizations contribute more than others, and I think we want to kind of get to a point where everyone is incented to contribute into this problem, because we'll ultimately be smarter and better collectively if we can find ways to encourage individuals and organizations to do that. So threat intelligence sharing, I believe, becomes critically important, and that again, that's going to start to cross back over into the subject matter for today's discussion, which is how do we make sure then, if we're going to share threat intelligence, that we balance the need for privacy with the need to understand information, or as my colleague David Hoffman likes to remind me, it takes data to protect data in many regards, and I think that's very, very true. And so one of the things that we've really spent a lot of time on inside of Intel and Intel Security is trying to think through what are ways in which we can do a better job of leveraging the information, the data that's available to us to enrich our understanding of a given campaign or a given attack that might be happening in a specific organization, but do so in a way that we better preserve privacy and get the right balance between the two. And that when we run into roadblocks around that we have the right mechanisms either for dialogue, for debate, for resolution that would allow us to continue with our mission, such that we have productive as opposed to unproductive conversations, and ultimately get ourselves to a point where we can raise the bar for security for everyone involved. So, with that, I do appreciate you all, again, including us, myself and David, in the discussion today. We certainly at Intel Security believe that this is an important set of conversations for us to have. We certainly believe that the more we can start to surface the issues now and deal with them as we start to leverage more practices like big data, analytics, like the need for enrichment of context around different types of attacks, as we get to broader scale threat intelligence sharing across the industry between and among public and private sector, that we're going to be in a better position to be successful, as opposed to spending a lot of our energies debating issues, debating subjects that aren't allowing us to move forward in the ultimate goals that we seek. So thank you all very much for that, and I appreciate your time this afternoon.
So while people take their seats, I'm going to sketch out the a somewhat parodied version of the question that I want us to debate today. So when Gabby Bloom and I wrote The Future of Violence, we outlined sort of three qualities of the threat environment that David flagged for me as sort of dovetailing in a very interesting way with the way Intel thinks about these questions. So the first was that the threats are becoming much more dangerous and much more distributed. And the incredible statistic that Chris just gave us, of this sort of exponential growth in daily new threat visibility is a really interesting example of that proposition. The second idea was that we need highly distributed actors to defend if you're going to have highly distributed threats. And that's a bit of a challenge to those of us who tend to think of security as a very centralized good, centrally provided good. And the third, which is one that I find that I'm arguing with people about all the time, is the idea that we need to stop thinking about security and privacy as fundamentally goods at odds with one another, and rather think of them fundamentally as species of the same value, essentially creatures that are more mutually supportive than mutually antagonistic. So David Hoffman is Intel's Chief Privacy Officer, and I'm going to start with you. I want you to lay out the strong version of the thesis that the trade-offs are largely optical, and we're really dealing in a world in which liberty, privacy, and security are mutually supported goods, at least delivered properly, not mutually antagonistic goods.
Yeah, so I think the way you ended that is great, Ben, because I would say that they can and should be values that reinforce each other. The reference that you made earlier in your introduction to Chris about the conversations that we had originally, particularly about your book. In that book, you laid out, I think in the chapter Rethinking Privacy that you had, the idea that privacy and security are values that live in hostile symbiosis. This idea that they can be values that work against each other, but they can be values that actually work for each other and support each other. And that's where Intel comes out. And I would say that what we want to do is think about the fact that privacy is something that's much more than just limiting the collection of information. We have a project at Intel. We've written a white paper on this. My colleague Paula Bruning and I, who is here, called Rethinking Privacy. And the focus of that effort is to try to make clear that privacy has never been about just limiting the collection of data. It's never been about just limiting the engagement with people, with each other. Privacy has been about allowing people to engage with each other. It's not about keeping people in cages where they never engage. It's about allowing interaction, allowing the sharing of information, but where that data is going to be protected in some way. That's why we had the 8 fair information practice principles that became codified in the OECD guidelines, where collection limitation is only one of those principles. But we have important other principles like use limitation, accountability, and individual participation that can guide us in situations where we need to use data in innovative ways to advance important social needs like greater security. We can dial up things on accountability. We can dial things up on individual participation to still allow robust privacy protection. Let me give an example of that. Something else that Paula and I worked on together, a law review article that's just come out in the University of North Carolina's Journal of Law and Technology about our view on the right to be forgotten, which we retool as the right to obscurity. This is a situation where we're talking about individual participation that allows people to actually come forward and say, I know there's going to be a lot of information out there about me. I know it's going to be used in innovative ways, and that's important. But I want to have some ability to understand what that is and to challenge it if I think it has disproportionate impact on me. we can take those same kinds of approaches in the area of security. And if we do, if we rethink our approach to privacy in the context of security, we can actually get to where they're reinforcing each other instead of in conflict.
Okay, so let me push you on that a little bit. So what are some examples for, an audience that does not, and I count myself as one, that does not have an intimate familiarity with Intel's businesses, various operations? What is an example of something where you guys are using data or collecting data in a fashion that somebody in a conventional privacy narrative may look at and say, hey, they shouldn't be collecting that data. But if you look at it from the point of view of what you're doing, how you're collecting it, how you're using it, and what you're doing with it, it actually serves to protect people's security and privacy.
Well, let's take the one that Chris mentioned, and also that Greg has done a large amount of highly productive work on, is taking a look at threat and vulnerability information sharing. And Chris mentioned several mechanisms where people are going to understand what information is being transmitted across the network. Some of that information is going to relate directly to individuals. Some of that is going to relate directly to machines, like IP addresses, that then may relate to individuals. We need to be able to not only process that information to provide effective cybersecurity, but we also need to be able to share that information with others. I understand that the sharing of that information then raises privacy implications. There are ways to drive use limitations and structured accountability with clear oversight where we can still protect privacy while driving better cybersecurity, which, by the way, drives more privacy, because the better the cybersecurity is, coming back to the fair information practice principles, security safeguards is one of those principles. The more we improve cybersecurity, the more we're going to be improving people's privacy.
Okay, so Greg, as we put this event together, we had a pretty extensive back and forth about the premise. And I detected in some of those emails that you had some anxieties about the premise here. To what extent is this view basically overly optimistic, and that there is a kind of inherent tension that all the best information practices in the world and all the use limitations in the world will not resolve? If you collect a lot of data, there's going to be privacy problems with that.
Thanks. Again, I'm Greg Nojheim with Center for Democracy and Technology.
Oh yes, I meant to be introducing people as I went.
Do you want to go?
No. I will allow Greg to have just introduced himself, but I will try to remember to do better with my future questions.
So I direct our project on freedom, security, and technology. I've been in the privacy field for about 20 years now and was very active on the cybersecurity information sharing legislation. What I reacted to when we were setting this up was what I perceived to be this notion that if only we could get more and more data and learn more and more from the data that we get, just bring it on, we'll be able to protect data better. And it reminded me of something else. It reminded me of that saying in the Vietnam War that we had to burn the village in order to protect it. That was how I received that notion. And I know, David, that's not what you're having in mind. You're not burning.
I'm glad that you recognize that that's not what we have in mind.
You're not burning the privacy
No burning
village.
of villages.
You're not burning the privacy village. So what do we do given that risk, right? That more data is good because you can draw more conclusions from it, but it's also more risky. You know, one of the first principles of privacy that we have always advocated is that if you don't have it, it can't be stolen. So if you're going to be collecting sensitive private information, you ought to have some limits on what you collect. You ought to only collect that which is needed. You ought to throw out that which isn't needed. There ought to be use restrictions on how you're using what you're getting, and there ought to be penalties. When we talk about accountability, that's one of the ways where that cybersecurity bill, I think, really fell short. A lot was done to make it so that there could be more sharing between the government and the private sector of information that would help each one learn more and do a better job of protecting data. But there weren't a lot of accountability mechanisms, particularly on the corporate side, that if a company used the data in a way that wasn't permitted in the bill really was about cybersecurity, if they used it for a different reason, there wasn't a good way for a consumer to hold the company accountable. And let me just finish up with, and then the other thing that strikes me about this is that, say you're in the business of protecting communications privacy, and that's what these are, a lot of them. They're communications that go from one person to another, and then you derive from those communications the threat indicators. If you're in that business, and say you're in the business of requiring that the government have a warrant for getting communications, that's my business. We had a good success just the other day. When we're creating exceptions to that, and I do think we need to have them in the cybersecurity context, you get a little antsy. And what you really want to do is define as narrowly as you can the information that's going to be subject to that exception. And you want to make it so that when the government gets it, and it will in this context, its uses are limited to the cybersecurity purposes for which the information was given. That, it seems like, to me, is a good framework.
Okay, so let me push you on that as well. So if you had to characterize when a company says, that's in the provision of cybersecurity goods business, says we need data in order plausibly to deliver the service that we are created to deliver, i.e., as David always says, we need data to protect data. We need data to protect privacy. What's your visceral reaction to that? Is that you should do it without it, or you should design the service, or that you should do it with it, but very carefully? What's your reaction to we need data to protect data?
I accept the premise. It makes sense. I think our biggest contribution to the cybersecurity legislation was helping congressional staff figure out how to define the information that must be shared. We worked on that really hard, really early, because that, to me, was where the best privacy protection would happen. It's at the collection stage. Because once you got down to the later stages, use restrictions, for example, I mean, the data goes from the private sector to the government. The government sees the data. It sees evidence of crime in the data. It's very hard to say, oh, well, you can use it for this crime, but not for that one. I mean, that doesn't strike the FBI and other law enforcement agencies as making a lot of sense. So the way we looked at it was, let's define functionally and flexibly, but as narrowly as we can, the data that will be collected. Let's set use restrictions on it, and then let's have some accountability mechanisms when those aren't, to make sure that they're followed.
Okay, so Susan is my colleague at Lawfare. She's Lawfare's managing editor. But for present purposes, the more interesting fact about Susan is that she, until coming to Lawfare, worked at a certain three-letter agency out at Fort Meade, where she did, among other things, cybersecurity-related work. So I'm interested in your reaction from the government side to this idea of data to protect data. Is this when we think of what NSA does, including in the cybersecurity space, we call it surveillance, right? We don't call it protecting data. We don't call it. But how would you describe the interaction between what NSA and other government actors that are in the data acquisition business are doing in relation to protecting data and protecting privacy?
So I think, first of all, it's important to sort of separate out the functions of the U.S. government that are about cybersecurity and data protection, network protection, and those that are about sort of surveillance and a different set of authorities. I think it's important to understand that it's a different group of people, even though they might be in the same physical location. I think one of the things that's really important is to define what the privacy value is in particular types of data, right? So certainly you need data to provide security, but not all data is alike, and its security value is not all the same. Likewise, its privacy value is not all the same. And so the importance of being able to articulate from the outset what is the privacy value of, for example, the actual open text communication in my email, incredibly high, versus getting down into all the little bits of metadata, right? And that the importance of breaking that all out, putting it on the table and saying, okay, how much of this do we need and where is it important? I think once you sort of, you take that approach, you can really view automation as being tremendously privacy protective. Because what you say is, when is the privacy value, when is privacy violated? When is privacy intruded on? Is it whenever a human being, is it when the information is collected, right? There's sort of this more generalized global concepts of privacy, and it's about sort of the control over information or other people not possessing it, or is it whenever a human being looks at it, or whenever it's collected in such a way that there's a possibility for a human being to look at it. And whenever you think about it as okay, if there's a piece of data that has relatively low privacy value in the first place, it goes through a computer system, no one ever sees it, and there's this sort of automated processing, that strikes me as privacy protective over having a person actually open it up and look at it. And so I think whenever you get into that framework, you can view sort of a dichotomy that's not about privacy versus security, but really is about privacy versus speed. So you can protect privacy. Somebody at DHS could open up every single thing and very carefully go through and make very specific redactions, and we could all get to a place that I think even Greg would be comfortable with, potentially. The problem is you can't do that on rapidly enough that the data is meaningful anymore, right? It's only this information is only meaningful from a security standpoint when it's shared very, very quickly, sometimes hundreds of thousands of times within sort of a number of seconds. And so I think that it's important to understand the need to go slowly, the need to undertake legislative reforms that are flexible and flexible of a world in which technology might evolve to be more privacy protective. So right now we have great capacity to do automated indicator sharing on particular types of data and to do all kinds of privacy filters, right? What are my parameters? How do we incorporate compliance checks into the data collection and sharing? We're really good at that on particular types of data. We're not so good on the others. So open source fields are one that is just really difficult. It's really hard to know what's in an open source field.
So break that out and explain what that is.
Right, so this is the difference. So the way that the Information Sharing Act, the portal that it sets up, is sort of a portal by which DHS sets out these a number of fields in which it can accept particular types of cyber threat indicators. So for a lot of those fields, it says, IP address, and if you enter in something that's not an IP address, it'll just reject it. It's sort of, we talk about like putting an animal into your credit card number. Like it's a mismatch, it doesn't work. And that's all great, and you can make a really strong case for why there's all these great automated privacy protections and nobody should be worried and everyone should be greatly reassured by the system itself. Then you get down to this last field, the open field, right? The field where we'll also give us whatever else you think we need to have. It's really hard to automate that field. It's also possible that the security value of that field is incredibly important. Things like attribution, intent. So I think that that efforts that are aimed at increasing the ability to automate privacy protection, increasing the ability to automate security scanning, and other sort of privacy control mechanisms actually both increases privacy and security sort of simultaneously.
All right, Laura. So Laura is a professor at Georgetown Law and a frequent sparring partner of mine on thematically related matters to this one. You have been very skeptical of the legal propriety of some of the government programs that involve mass acquisition of data, which you have analogized to the general warrant, or maybe more than analogized. You've asserted that they sort of are general warrants. How do you react? Do you like it any better when David Hoffman says, I get to collect a whole lot of stuff, and it'll be in your privacy interest for me to do it the way I want to do it?
Okay, so yeah, I just wrote a book on the future of foreign intelligence, privacy and surveillance in a digital world. It came out with Oxford about 4 weeks ago that looks and actually says that what the NSA was doing is illegal. It was unconstitutional and statutorily under Section 215 illegal. What I want to address first is this idea that if no person looks at it, there's no privacy violation. If we're in the shower and somebody puts a camera in the bathroom and says, I'm just going to record what happens in the bathroom, but I promise I'm not going to look at it. Is there a privacy violation? And I think most of us would say, yeah, that's a violation of my privacy to put a camera in my bedroom, in my bathroom, in my daily conversations with my spouse, with my children. That's a privacy violation because privacy is not from you, government perspective. Privacy is from my perspective. Kat's got that right? Privacy is from our perspective. When we have a reasonable and an objective expectation of privacy, if the government collects that information, privacy is violated. So I just reject this. Well, if a machine reads it, not us, and we promise not to read it unless it's really important, and then we'll do it secretly in a highly classified environment, there's no privacy violation. It's just not true, right? So that's the first thing. The second, in terms of these privacy interests that we see, the distinguishing between different kinds of privacy, the court has tried to do this since Katz in 1967, but most of the doctrine was developed when we didn't have the technologies that we now have. And all of those distinctions between different privacy interests, privacy levels are breaking down. So I'll just give you 4 quick examples. One is the difference between public space and what happens inside the curtilage of your home. So in case after case, the court has said, well, once you leave your home, you have no privacy interest. Similarly, if somebody's outside your home and looks into it from the street, you have no privacy interest. Well, what happens when we have 24/7, 60/60 surveillance as you go about your public daily lives with GPS chips, with CCTV, with facial recognition systems? What happens when somebody knows everything you do and from that can put together detailed information about your interests, your beliefs, your friendships, your intimate relationships? Suddenly you do have a privacy interest in what happens in public space. Or what about the distinction between third-party data and personal information? The court in 1978 in a case called Smith v. Maryland said you have no privacy interest in the numbers that you call from your telephone because the telephone company has to connect that line. Therefore, you are telling the phone company who you are dialing, and therefore you don't have a privacy interest in it. Well, then we find out with Section 215 that the NSA has been collecting all of our telephony metadata for nearly a decade and using this to build complex social relationships and social patterns in society. And by the way, it also includes trunk identifier information, which is your location. So now you have a cell phone that travels around with you and builds all of your social networks, shows the depth of those connections, shows where you've been for the past nearly a decade, and doctrine would have us believe you have no privacy interest in that. Or domestic versus international. So traditionally, the courts have said no Fourth Amendment interest overseas, Fourth Amendment interest in the United States. Later on in the mid-20th century, they said, well, okay, you have a reasonableness requirement, but no warrant requirement. And now, if I send an email to somebody and it happens to travel internationally, I have a lesser privacy protection, even though the content of that email is exactly the same as if I had sent a letter to somebody across town. And so if you go through all of these Fourth Amendment distinctions that were meant to discern what has a higher privacy interest or a lower, they are falling down in the face of this kind of technological onslaught that we're seeing in terms of privacy interests.
So, but Laura, all of that is compelling if the person to your left is doing the collection. That is, if Susan is or if the FBI is doing the collection. But what if it's the person to your right? What if it's David saying, hey, we're gonna collect a lot of data. You may be you're gonna click through some agreement to allow us to do it. And by the way, we're going to use it only subject to the FIPS and only to protect you and every other user like similarly situated to you. Does that bother you the same amount, less, or is that okay because you clicked through that agreement?
Yeah, so three responses to that. First is when the industry does this at the behest of the government, you have a Fourth Amendment interest. So if the government goes to Intel and says, we want this data, you can make a Fourth Amendment claim because they are forcing Intel to engage in this behavior. So to the extent that the Verizon orders, for instance, for Section 215, they were forcing the company to turn over the data, there is a Fourth Amendment claim there. So that's the first point to make. So this private-public partnership, the strength of that changes your constitutional protection. Right. The second point to make is the security versus, and so in that case, the Fourth Amendment reads the right of the people to be secure. So it's not like liberty versus security. It's liberty is security. Liberty is being secure against governmental overreach, right? The second point to make about this idea, this kind of dichotomy, is there are lots of different kinds of security at stake. And so to the extent that Intel is concerned about one kind of security, there are other kinds of security, like economic security. So when Section 702 information hit the public domain and our cloud computing industry took a bath internationally, our economic competitiveness went down as a country. And I would hesitate to put the decision in one particular industry or one particular agency that has such widespread economic effects on the country. And it's not just economic security, it's financial security. It's all of our financial security. And this gets back to Greg's point. To the extent that companies are using this information, trading this information, showing this information to others, that does affect our financial security. There's an incompatibility there. It's physical security. It's data integrity. There are lots of other kinds of security. And the third point that I would bring up is there are other things that matter too in this equation. It's not just the security of technology, it's things like resource expenditures. So what else is being missed because all the attention is being drawn to this particular topic? Is it the tail wagging the dog? And I think there are some very serious concerns about that for citizens that extend to both commercial entities focused on this as well as governmental.
All right, so Danny, last but not least. Danny Weitzner is at MIT these days, but that is a pale description of who he is. Not that there's anything wrong with MIT. Danny's one of the founders of CDT. Is that fair to say? And was at the White House for a while doing privacy and other stuff, and is, in my mind, just one of the very wise people whom I always consult about questions like this. And that's really the capacity in which he's here. So Danny, Danny walked up to me in the sort of reception before and said, this is really all about trust. And I want to flesh that out. It's, how much of this breaks down to if you trust Intel, if when Chris Young says we need your data to protect your data and you believe that, and they have a track record of doing that and not abusing your data, that's good enough. And if they don't have a track record of doing that, or if you lose by doing that over time, that's, and similarly, when Susan says, here's how we're going to use your data as, I'm making Susan personify NSA here, which is a little unfair. That there is an iterative process through which we establish or erode trust with government agencies, and that ultimately, this is really just about that iterative process.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to everyone, Hoover, Brookings, Lawfare, Intel, CDT, everyone who organized, thank you. So I think it really is about trust, and I think the reason why I think it's about trust is because of the privacy doctrine, the Fourth Amendment doctrine that Laura cited. It's because we've always recognized that privacy has as much of a subjective component as an objective component. That there a lot of the reason why we care about privacy is we want people to feel secure in the broadest sense, as Laura and the Fourth Amendment says. and we don't want people to walk around worrying about who's looking at them at every second, or what might happen with the information that's collected at some point, at some later point in the future. Of course, everyone understands there's a lot of data out there about us. A lot of companies have it, a lot of government agencies have it, a lot of our friends have it. So I think you kind of heard this consensus really on the panel that we're sort of past the point of saying let's put the whole genie back in the bottle and just say we can have much, much less data and make our privacy problems much, much smaller. So we can't do that, and arguably we've never really been able to do that. But the reason that I suggest that it's about trust, the reason I don't think there's really a security-privacy trade-off here as much as a challenge to make sure that we have a trustworthy environment, is that we really are going to create all kinds of problems for ourselves as a society if we start building private infrastructure that people don't feel safe and secure and trusted in, if we start having government agencies that people don't feel safe and secure and confident to interact with. So I think that how do you get people to trust anything? I think that I think trust basically has two components, and people have said most of this. Trust is about transparency. It's about knowing that there's some way to know when something has gone wrong, and about some sense of accountability, that if the government or Intel or anyone else collects data and uses it in a way that they shouldn't use it, contrary to the rules, then there's some mechanism of accountability and ultimately punishment. Why was the whole Snowden NSA thing such a drama? Many reasons, I suppose. But in some part because I think no one felt that they had any way of knowing what was going on at the NSA. I think the NSA tried to say, well, look, we were actually just following the rules that you set for us. And so we can argue about whether 215 as it was constituted and interpreted by the FISA court is constitutional or isn't. And you could argue about all that. But I actually think it's fair to say, based on what we know, with the exception of a couple things like breaking into back-end fiber optic cables and few things that really shouldn't have never happened. But that a lot of what happened, a lot of what got attention, were things that the NSA said, I think with some reason, was within the bounds of what they thought they were allowed to do, but they had no way to show the public that that's actually what was happening. And so the result was that there was a real significant breakdown in trust. And as people who know this and who followed this, that went all the way up to the chief judge at the time of the FISA court, who said, I don't even know whether the NSA is following the orders that I have imposed on them. So that's clearly not a trustworthy environment. But we can reestablish trust, I think, by being serious about transparency and accountability. What I think is the actual trade-off that's going to be hard is the trade-off between doing good cybersecurity, because that's what we're talking about here, collecting and analyzing threat intelligence thoroughly, carefully, creatively, in innovative ways. Between doing that and doing all kinds of second-order things that are about enforcing other rules. The federal government, parts of the federal government, have a very hard time giving up on the idea that all the data that flows through the federal government is somehow possibly evidence of a crime. Because, of course, it's true. It is all somehow possibly evidence of a crime. People in the law enforcement agencies have a hard time saying, when we collect data for cybersecurity purposes, we just won't touch it for that reason. Maybe we think they should, maybe we think they shouldn't, but we've left enormous amount of wiggle room, I think more wiggle room than we should be comfortable with in those secondary uses of the data. And I think the same is going to be true in enterprises. We haven't talked a whole lot about enterprise-level cybersecurity. Now, of course, government agencies are enterprises as well, and they have kind of all the same dynamics, except with a lot more complicated rules of doing enterprise cybersecurity. We have, the companies that provide a service, the companies that we work in, all do an enormous amount of data collection, and we're going to have the same set of challenges where companies, I think, eventually will have to decide about how far they're going to go in using the data that they have about their employees, that they have about their customers, that they have about their peers and competitors, data that could be useful for cybersecurity threat detection purposes, but also has secondary uses. And so I think the trade-off that we face here is one about discipline that says we really have to get better at using all the information that we have. We have to be able to analyze it very aggressively. I think Chris and Young and David would probably agree from a technical perspective, we are still at absolute baby steps on this. I mean, I would love to be able to tell you from the halls of MIT and other great research institutions that we can just like look out at this massive data and right away zero in on where the threats and act on them. Of course, that's nonsense. We know very, very little, relatively speaking, about how to do that. Though I think we will learn more and more. We need to learn more and more because it's the only way that we're going to make progress. But we're going to have to, the trade-off I think we should be focusing on is one that asks whether institutions are prepared to be disciplined enough to live by a set of rules that they can then be accountable to and say, yeah, sorry, there may be evidence of tax evasion in information that's flowing around some enterprise network or some commercial interaction with government, but we're going to leave that to the side because we care more about protecting the infrastructure.
So when you hear, and I mean, we're picking on David because Intel is here, but I mean Google, you could have the same conversation about Google, right? Google says, look, I mean, we collect an enormous amount of data. In fact, you voluntarily provide it as our. We reserve the right to monetize that data, but we behave according to these rules, which are up there. We give you a lot of control on the site. And David says we need your data to protect you and your data. How do you evaluate like a claim when a company says that? Is your reaction policies and track record is the basis? Is it I'll rely on the FTC to bring an enforcement action if there's a problem? What's the mechanism that you look at and say that's either a valid, legit claim, I'm willing to let that company process my data to protect me, or not?
Right. So number one, I as a user and as someone who thinks about the design of these big infrastructures want those infrastructure providers, whether it's Google, Intel, or anyone else, to analyze the hell out of that data, out of my data. I expect them to do it. If they're not doing it, I think they're falling down on the job, and I want to go get a different service provider. So that's
So you
number
basically
one.
buy David's premise.
I want them to do it, but how do I know whether to trust that they're doing it within the bounds of the rules that I would find acceptable? There are different cases for different companies. Google's under a 20-year consent decree with the FTC. The FTC goes and pokes around, looks pretty carefully at what's going on. They probably should be looking a lot more carefully. Google does a number of things now that tells me certain things, tells its users certain things about what data they have about the users and what they're doing with it. I would like to see that be a much more robust process. And I would like to know, just in the way that we're used to having bank regulators who, basically camp out at banks, right? I mean, they live there and they spend all their time looking through the books, analyzing data. We learned just a day or two ago that they ended up deciding that the orderly bankruptcy wind-up plans weren't quite so good. How do they do that? Because they look very carefully at what's going on. I think that we need, and I think Chris Young said this, we need better automated systems to evaluate how data is used and whether it's used according to those rules. We do not have those in place. I think actually, agencies like the NSA are, as far as I can tell, at the high watermark of doing that kind of thing, but mostly what they're doing is they're looking at who accesses what data. Is the right person looking at the right data, or is the wrong person looking at the wrong data? That's a start, but that's really only the very, very beginning. We've all talked about usage rules, about wanting to make sure that data collected for one purpose isn't used for another purpose. As far as I understand NSA systems, just on what's been said publicly, there's a certain amount of that tries to distinguish foreign intelligence information. There are statutory distinctions that are to some extent represented in systems in an automated way, but we're only at the very, very, very beginning of that. And I think for the public to feel confident that whether it's the NSA or Google, we have to feel that, just as we are pretty confident that Google delivers our email to us because we understand how that system works and it seems to be repeatable, we should have the same kind of confidence that the systems are actually keeping track of themselves and there's actually a way to have public visibility into that process.
Laura, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I don't think it's about trust, actually. Sorry, there we go. I think trust is on the right track. I think it's about power. It's about who has power over you. And this is something, we didn't invent this. The founding generation knew this well. You don't want to give the government power over you. They have things like jails and prisons and guns and weapons. They can head off political opposition. They can target people, use the information to discredit you. If you go back to Blackstone, Hawkins, Hale, Cook, all of the writings that the founders depended on, James Otis's oration in Paxton's case, this is what they worried about, that the government would collect all this information and be able to use it to head off opposition and use it in ways that were unsavory. And then we've seen in our history where this has happened. So why people, I think, are more comfortable going with David's premise is distributed risk and power relationships. So if I contract with Google and I contract with Intel and maybe Symantec and Palo Alto and others, perhaps others, I can distribute my risk. And by the way, they don't have guns and weapons and can't put me in jail and stop me from speaking publicly. If the government then has access to all of that information, not just from Intel, but also from Symantec and also from Google and also from Amazon and also from all these, and puts it together, that's a far more onerous proposition, at least in terms of constitutional liberties.
So I agree that we need trust. We need to have a sense of trust because we worry about abuse of power very, very clearly. We presumably, though, don't want to be in continual warfare, right? I think your point about power is quite interesting. There is a response from a number of people in the kind of tech community that actually takes your premise and says, therefore, the only way to protect our privacy is to encrypt the heck out of everything and be restore the balance of power through purely sort of technical self-help means. And I think that's an unfortunate result. I think that's a sign that people have given up on the view that the government can do anything to balance out the power that I think you very rightly point to. But I don't think we want to live in a world where we basically say to everyone, you have to have a gun that's as big as the government's, because I think we know that doesn't work. So I think we have to find balance. We have to find mechanisms that sort of define where the power is and have a way to manage it, or at least have accountability for it. If we accept that I just don't think we want to be in the sort of Leviathan world. That's the world that cryptographers design their products to, and I don't think it's a nice place to live.
So just a quick comment on that, I'm encouraged because I think it sounds like just about everybody at the table is saying, yes, we shouldn't have to think about privacy and security as necessarily antithetical, and that they can and should reinforce each other. I also hear this, people keep coming back to the concepts of the FIPS, and this is something that we can do. I think Greg's comment about collection limitation being the first one you look to, and that we should only collect the information that's necessary. Greg, I agree with you, and we say that Paul and I say that in the paper. Collection limitation is very important. I think the problem we're going to find is that people are going to say what's necessary is a lot of information. And so I'm not sure that gets you where you need to go, which takes me to Laura's point, which I think is incredibly important. What I hear us trying to do is let's then drill down on these other FIPS, like openness, like individual participation, like use limitation, and critically, like accountability. The founding generation understood that we were going to be a representative democracy with checks and balances, that there were going to be institutions that were also going to be government institutions that would hold organizations accountable, both private sector organizations and government organizations. Intel has thought that this is critically important for a long time. We've called for over a decade for comprehensive federal privacy legislation for the privacy sector to demand organizations to demonstrate that they're accountable. I think now is the time for us to really be drilling down on what are the right mechanisms for demanding accountability for some of the things we're concerned about now. We're going to have a change in leadership of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. We should be really asking the question, what can we do to make that organization as effective as possible? Mark Groman and the administration's created a Privacy Officers Council within the government. We should be asking, how can we make Mark and that organization as effective as possible? these are the kinds of mechanisms we should be looking for to really drive accountability.
Okay, so Greg has been trying to jump in, but before he does, I wanna put something on the table for both you and him to address, in addition to whatever else he wants to address. You focused on one thing that Laura said, but I want to focus on something else that Laura said, which is that there is a deep anxiety in Laura's comments about what happens when you guys collect stuff for your own purposes and then the government has access to it and it functions as government collection subject to some less than content-oriented standard, and then you scale that across several other organizations. And so my question to anybody who wants to address it is, what's the answer to that? You know, that you have Intel collecting lots of data to protect its security goods customers, but then Susan comes along and with a 702 order and says, I get it. And all of a sudden, you may be in a very different place, at least in Laura's concerns.
Can you say why that isn't a problem today? I mean, I
is a
understand.
No, no,
the
it
point.
is. I mean,
I mean, that's today, right? It's not that David's saying he wants more data. He's just saying, I'm going to use the data that I already have, that's already spread out all over the place.
But the answer really is, you've kind of put your finger on it. There's a choke point. There's this moment when the data moves from the private sector into the government. It's a choke point. And the question that I think we have to answer as a society is, are we going to make that choke point meaningful? My view on the 702 issue is that standard for when it moves from the private sector to the government is just so weak that it's not really a meaningful restriction. And so I think there's a significant problem there. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I really wanted to talk about was on the corporate side. What we were trying to do in the cybersecurity bill was figure out a way to make it so that the companies played by pretty loose rules, that the rules were not that strict on what the companies could and couldn't do with data that they had. But we wanted them to play by them. So we came up with ideas like, the first idea wasn't ours. It was from a staffer. Well, if you really want to know whether the companies are playing by the rules, let the government know what they're doing with data. If they share data between each other, make there be a BCC to the government. And to which I said, well, that's like burning the privacy village in order to save it. You know, all this data that doesn't have to go to the government then goes to the government. It's not a good accountability mechanism. Second idea was...
we're burning a lot of villages here.
It's terrible. It's terrible. The second idea was sampling. Let's make it so that a auditing agency can come in and see what this particular company is doing, and the company can even have a role in choosing who the auditor is about their conduct. Let's have them come in and see whether the company is abiding by the rules. Well, that didn't go over very well either. I don't think any of the companies signed off on that. The other idea was private right of action. If you violate the rules, let there be a private right of action and some duty somehow to notify people that there was a violation of the rules. That didn't go over either. So what do we have? We don't have anything. David, what's the answer? How do we make sure that the companies that are in this private info sharing environment, government's not even involved, how do we make sure that they play by the rules?
And so, Greg, I'd ask you back, which rules are you actually concerned about in this context? So right now it seems like you're talking about private-to-private information sharing.
For cyber reasons.
For cybersecurity reasons. So you're talking about information that private sector entities have collected through their products and services, right? My solution that I've always said in that situation, I think we need comprehensive federal privacy legislation based on the Fair Information Practice Principles that applies to the private sector. We're one of the very few developed countries in the world that really doesn't have it. I think we would have that. And then part of that, since it's based on the Fair Information Practice Principles, has concepts around accountability where you would force organizations to demonstrate that they are behaving responsibly. Now, if there are individual uses that you are concerned about in that particular context that are problems, that this doesn't involve the government taking action, but involves the private sector taking action, then I think within legislation, whether it's from a best practices standpoint or something, determining what those uses are that we're concerned about and making clear that it's outside the bounds of what's acceptable, that's something that's reasonable for people to talk about.
So I want to, sorry, go ahead,
I just
Susan.
want to sort of briefly interject 2 points, one general and one responsive to David's last point. One sort of the all roads lead to NSA, and so we are not collecting information under 215 or 702. Like this is a whole other thing. It's a different right. So there's, I think there is kind of almost an emotional conflation here of sort of do we trust the government writ large versus what is the function of sort of cybersecurity information sharing as a very limited thing that is housed through civilian agencies within the federal government and not intelligence or military agencies. I think the second point is to understand that CISA is actually a limitation on what existed before. There were no rules before, right? So people shared, and maybe you violated parts of ECPA. It wasn't totally clear, and some people really were very forward-leaning on which parts of the government they shared with. They shared a lot with the FBI or not with the NSA, or they shared everything with the NSA. It was sort of this pick-and-choose world in which consumers really had no way of knowing what the relationships between individual companies and the government looked like, or what individual companies weren't really aware of what they were able to share with each other and not violate trade laws and other sort of monopoly rules. And so I think that it's important to understand that the legislation really imposed a structure, and a structure that, while not on every single facet, on a great many number of meaningful facets, actually represents a limitation on what existed before and not an expansion.
I'm sorry. I just have to respond to that. I think that's a unique perspective. This statute begins in all of its operative sections with, notwithstanding any law, you may. I mean, that's how this statute works. And to say that puts it in a box, I mean, really.
So sure, there are certainly particular elements of the monitoring authorizations with ECPA.
It's monitoring, it's information sharing, it's the operation of countermeasures. Notwithstanding any law, you can do all these things that we're talking about. That is not a restrictive approach.
Right, though if you look at the totality of the law, there is one very narrow set of information which affirmatively could not have been shared previously that now could be shared. Certainly the alterations of ECPA monitoring is meaningful, although again doesn't implicate the government because it's relevant to private sectors, private industry's ability to monitor their own networks. I think it's important to understand every provision of the law is confined to networks and information that an individual company owns and operates. It's their own. You can do countermeasures within your own systems. You can monitor within your own systems. So the only piece where it touches the government is the sharing piece that certainly merits specific intention. But I think that it's important not to kind of to really keep all of the various threads here distinct and clear.
Okay, so I want to go to questions from the audience, but while the mic is getting ready to be passed around, Danny, David held out comprehensive privacy legislation as part of the answer, and you know something about the long tortured history of that subject, and I'm interested for your reaction to that.
I think that it is. I think that one thing that we know. There's two things that we know. Citizens, users of all the services that we have out in the marketplace, are very worried about how their privacy is protected. They might be too worried, but they are objectively worried. They are in fact worried. Number two, I think that we have a lot of businesses that spin a lot of wheels trying to figure out just what it is that they're supposed to do with any given new service. And I think that we sort of properly struggle in this country with providing the right kind of balance of consumer protection on the one hand and openness to innovation on the other hand. I think that we could alleviate a lot of concern. I think we could assure a lot of consumers. I think we could give companies a lot of useful guidance if we would pass a law that would clarify the obligations of the Federal Trade Commission in this area. I think it would help. I think it would also help with respect to our relationships with other countries, particularly Europe. Right now, the U.S. is losing the global battle to define what privacy means. And I think we are losing it to the detriment of our companies. We're losing it to the detriment of free speech and free flow of information. And I think and to be very specific, what I mean by that is that the European privacy laws say to countries all around the world, if you want to do business with Europe, that is, if you want to be able to transfer personal information about European citizens to third countries, you have to prove as a third country that you are, quote, adequate, that you provide adequate data protection. Europe does not believe that the U.S. provides that, which I think is a mistaken determination, but it is their judgment. And so I think we have allowed the European view of privacy, which has many merits, but some real limitations, to define the global marketplace, and I think that that has very significant costs. So we should pass comprehensive privacy legislation. The one thing I will say is what we will never do, and I think should never do, is sweep aside all the different sectoral laws that we have. I actually think we have a good privacy model in the U.S. where we've regulated privacy sector by sector by sector. We have all these fights about what do we do with electronic surveillance, about what do we do with national intelligence, about what do we do with health data, what do we do with financial data, et cetera, et cetera. These are all really different environments. They demand really different kinds of analysis and really different kinds of privacy approaches. So I think it's good that we have the approach that we have, but we have this one big gap where we kind of leave the FTC to kind of make it up. And I think they do a decent job of it, but it creates uncertainty for everyone, and I think we should fix it. How soon will we fix it? I actually believe that we will, because I think that the current arrangement with the FTC is actually not stable. I think that the FTC was able to handle, I think, quite well what was essentially an extension of the regulation of the advertising industry and the direct marketing industry from the offline world to the online world. That's a lot of what the FTC has done on privacy. We now have all these other areas that David and others have mentioned, Internet of Things, self-driving cars, one thing after another, after another, after another. And I think that it's going to be harder for a single agency with a very broad but sort of poorly defined jurisdiction and set of authorities to actually manage that.
I just want to point out that buried in that comment was a prediction that Congress would actually do something, which you don't hear that very often in Washington.
States will do it first. States will do it first and are doing it.
Yeah. So please, if you have a question, be visible so I can see you, and give your name and formulate something as a question directed at a person, preferably. Yes, right there.
Thanks very much. I'm Stephen Dockery with the Wall Street Journal. My question is, I guess, to David and the rest of the panel is, will the corporate world get behind some type of overarching legislation to fix this in a meaningful way? Because I think CISA was a good example of that not really happening from the individual privacy person's perspective. It seemed to be adopted at the 11th hour in the face of privacy advocates going towards corporate interests. So is that something we could see on the horizon, a banding together of companies to push this forward? Because that seems how things get done in Congress.
Well, I think what I would say, and then be interesting other people's thoughts, particularly be interesting Greg's thoughts on that. We've seen it happen to a limited extent before. Intel's worked with, I can name a few companies that have come out publicly. Microsoft has supported it, HP has supported it, eBay has supported it. Some of the telecommunications companies have come out and said that they would support examining the issue and trying to find a good solution. So there are clearly major players, particularly information and technology company players, who see the problem that's being created by the dynamic that we have, that as there is more data out there that relates to us as individuals, that's actually a lower percentage of that data that's out there that came directly from us. So to the degree that we have risks that are created, a model that says that it's based on whether you decided to exercise control to provide that data in the first place, for the reasons that it's not coming directly from us, and from a lot of the reasons that Laura said, that you have limited rights to affect data that actually gets out there about you, this is going to become more and more important. If we think it's important to use that and data, and we think it's important to have the ethical and innovative use of data broadly for the economy and to move forward with society, I don't know how we avoid examining it and moving forward.
Yeah, and Stephen, I would add to that. I think that there are judicial, structural, and also political things that have to be done in addition to the legislation. So on the judicial side, the third-party doctrine that we have in this country says you have no privacy interest in third-party in third-party information. I think that's very deeply problematic from a European perspective in many ways. And I think in order to catch up with this technologically engaged world in which we live, you cannot live in the modern world without giving personal information to third parties. So I think our judicial doctrine has to catch up. Structurally, when this information came out about 702, 215, and general activities, the National Security Council does not have Treasury or any economic interest as a permanent member of the NSC. And certainly at a programmatic level in NSA and elsewhere, you don't have the economic interest of the country always being championed at that level. And I think that's deeply problematic. If you think of economic security as part of national security, we should have somebody thinking through before we pose as LinkedIn, NSA to collect other people's data, or before you launch these huge programs, to think through the economic impact on our country, on our companies, and how that would affect their competitiveness. That's the structural fix. And certainly politically, there is a lot of opportunism in Europe right now. Certainly after the Snowden documents were released, there was a lot of self-interest coming from Berlin and coming from elsewhere, that they were using this also as an opportunity to get ahead commercially. And I think politically we really have to push back against that. When the UK comes out and says we're more privacy protective, but gosh, if you say anything glorifying terrorism, we'll throw you in prison, you have to think, well, wait a minute, there's a contradiction going on here, and you need to push really hard, I think, diplomatically and politically on claims that Europe now will do no business with the United States, because of course they would never do this. I just think that's not true, and there's a lot of opportunism that I think politically has to be countered as well.
I think in some ways we want to accept the push. And let me explain what I mean by that. You asked whether there would be comprehensive privacy legislation in the time frame Danny described without putting a number of years on it, or whether companies would support it. So some companies have supported a version of a comprehensive bill. It's been a long time that this idea has been on the table. It hasn't moved forward. It tends to be the case that for some companies, anything with teeth is not going to be acceptable to them. So there's this problem of how strong would a law be if it only moved with just company support. The reason I was saying that maybe we should let Europe push us a little bit is because in some ways they're pushing us in a good direction on the privacy side. The Court of Justice of the European Union recently invalidated the safe harbor agreement between the United States and Europe that allows the flow of data. Now, this is a big problem. There needs to be a way to transfer data, but what the European Court is insisting on is that U.S. surveillance laws be a little better, particularly when it comes to the transfer of data, particularly when it comes to the sharing of data that U.S. companies have that's been transferred from Europe with the U.S. government. So in that sense, I think we could use a little push because it would help us do the right thing to protect that data and to protect privacy so that we make that court happy?
So we've got about 10 minutes. We've got the gentleman over there. We've got several other people. So if everybody could keep questions brief, and if panelists could now truncate answers to the bare minimum, we'll get more people in. Sir.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. So Greg, you just provided the perfect segue for my question. So the European Court of Justice pushed the U.S. in a certain direction, which was about reforming U.S. government surveillance. The administration and the European Commission responded with a bunch of changes to how the U.S. would regulate the private sector's use of data. Pretty non-responsive. And so my question is, for the panel, I'm a bit mystified by the conclusion here that the remedy to these concerns is comprehensive baseline privacy regulation of the private sector, because the things that you've discussed today, it seems to me, are really about the interface between the private sector and government, unless you take the view that Greg articulated at the outset that the way to deal with that problem is just to have the private sector hold less. There are a number of things that could be done, and the thing that nobody talked about today was the one respect in which the FTC really is inadequate is that it's not a DPA. It has no authority over government. It has no ability to talk about what government does. So I'm just curious to hear from the panel, what's the disconnect? What do you actually think a comprehensive baseline privacy legislation such as the FTC requested would do about these problems? Or are there other ways that might be more politically feasible to address the concerns you've raised?
So can I just stress that in a quick truncated form? So my comment about comprehensive privacy, federal privacy legislation, was in direct response to the question of what do we do on private sector to private sector sharing. I also did mention earlier a number of things that I think we need to directly look at for our accountability mechanisms over government handling of information. I think that's where we want to look at the PCLOB. I think we want to look at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. I think we need to take a look specifically at how our congressional oversight committees are working in this system. We live in a representative democracy. We expect that there's not going to be full openness to all citizens, but that our oversight committees in Congress serve an important role. Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion there that even members of some of those oversight committees don't believe that they're functioning in a way that has allowed them to be able to do that. I'm not saying that I have an opinion on that either way, but I think we owe it to the American people to have a discussion about that. If there are issues there, we get something in place that actually puts that in a better place.
Just very quickly, I wouldn't offer comprehensive consumer privacy legislation as the answer to all the problems we're talking about here. I actually think in the case of cybersecurity threat information sharing under CISA, as you know, there's a big set of rulemakings that's going to be kicked off. There's a huge amount of implementation activity that DHS and others have to do. I think that the way they do that is going to matter a lot. I think there's a lot of discretion in how those rules get written. I think they could be written in a way to be more open, provide more transparency, more accountability, or less. And I think DHS should now stand up and prove that they can be trusted with handling this information. And I think the statute gives them the latitude to do that. That's where the rubber hits the road on all of this, and that's how we're going to learn the real answer to your question, which is, do we have enough of the right framework in place when it's implemented in a good faith, privacy protective way, or do we need more?
So I think on consumer privacy, that will get us into a better competitive position. I think that really just goes to the competitiveness question. And it was the FTC that brought all of the safe harbor violations to the attention. The EU actually was not telling the FTC about safe harbor violations prior to this. Over the past decade, it was all the FTC finding them. We just need to make that more transparent and make it clear that we're engaging in consumer protection. The surveillance objections coming from Germany and elsewhere, that we're tapping Angela Merkel's phone, I was really kind of mystified by the outcry over this. And I was in England at the time, and there was really a consensus. It's not that countries don't do that. It's just that it's a little unseemly to talk about it, right? And there was this sense like, oh, yes, of course we all wiretap each other. We just don't talk about it. And so I'm not surprised that the focus has really been drawn to the consumer privacy, because for American competitiveness, that's where we need to be. And last time I checked, Angela Merkel was the head of another country that in the 20th century we have had issues with, and I don't see how changing our surveillance techniques of foreign countries' leaders is really going to affect this underlying issue, which is consumer protection, consumer privacy.
Ma'am?
Hi, I'm Tina. I'm from the American Enterprise Institute. I work specifically in cyber technology and tech policy. And I have a question regarding on IoT, and you've touched on it a little bit, but I want to talk specifically on the standards that were just released. So UL released earlier last week, their 2900 series on IoT security. And then the IoT Trust Working Group that was backed by Microsoft, Symantec, ADT, Target, a bunch of other big industry players. They released their IoT Trust Framework. I know I Am the Cavalry is also releasing another IoT framework in the next few months or so. And so to what extent would those kind of standards and certification programs replace or be somewhat analogous to like a FIP for the private sector that David talked about earlier? And would that even be adequate? Like, would that fill the gap in terms of the privacy and security? They do talk about, HTTPS and SSL, TSL responsibilities and responsible disclosures. So is that kind of voluntary program adequate?
I think it's necessary but not sufficient. It's great to have security standards. You need them for interoperability purposes. You can't do network security without some kind of standards framework. They have to be implemented well and carefully. And in my lab, we've looked at a number of the different Bluetooth implementations on various consumer electronics devices. Some of them are disastrous, create enormous vulnerabilities. Why does that happen? In the end, because no one's really responsible legally, or it's sort of no one who implements these things feels particularly financially responsible. So, I think we need a combination. The standards alone are not going to guarantee anyone's security.
And just a brief note on sort of. As we evaluate things like IoT standards, I think it's important to engage in sort of a collective whole conversation here, and to understand that that as certain privacy rights or government restraint are sort of created in particular areas, we're likely to see pressure in other areas. And so I think it's important for sort of, for example, the IoT industry to pay attention to the fact that in the encryption debate, one of the offered solutions is, oh, no, we're not going dark because IoT is going to create all of this data. I think that now is the time for that industry to say, well, wait a minute, we don't know that we are the solution, and to really ensure that we're having a comprehensive discussion that is aware of the equilibrium and the places that we might be making trade-offs right now that we don't fully understand the consequences of as technologies evolve.
Message to the thermostat industry, rise up now. We have time for one more batch of questions, and then I'm going to give everybody a chance to wrap up. So if you have gentleman here, if anybody else wants to go ahead.
My name is Elias, and I'm with the Global Governance Institute. And David, I found your comments around sort of these principles that constitute privacy being more than just one very intriguing. And you look at it in the context of what's happening in Europe vis-a-vis the transfer of data to the US. And of course, Safe Harbor was invalidated. But there's a new agreement that was recently released, and now we're seeing sort of stories about regulators from the European side saying it does not pass muster. Now, as a compliance officer, as a guy who had to comply with these rules, I can tell you that it's certainly more than just about use limitation, right? And you talk about sort of security standards that do exist, and you compare the standards that you have here across the Atlantic. You do see that we have greater standards. And so I'm wondering, though, but you also talked about federal privacy legislation. And that got me a bit concerned in the sense that if you ask me about my experiences with Safe Harbor, I will tell you that that particular industry we're working in, that question of the NSA collecting the data does not even come into play, in the sense that the data ends up being made public. And so when you talk about sort of federal legislation, I'm wondering, what exactly are you hinting at?
Let me make just a brief comment about that, and we can follow up later if we want. I do find it very odd that we've reached a situation where people are concerned about transferring information to the United States because of our model for allowing law enforcement and the government under very limited situations and with a tremendous amount of oversight and governance to be able to access the information. But the same issues have not been raised of sending information out of Europe to a great number of countries that they do business with regularly, and a tremendous amount of personal information is transmitted, where their law enforcement and national security agencies have limited to possibly no oversight and control. So I think it's really important that when I call to reflect that when I call for comprehensive federal privacy legislation for the private sector, I am in no way saying that I agree that we are not adequate as in terms of the data protection directive and the requirements for international data transfer. I do think that the Court of Justice of the European Union got the case wrong. I think that I do not agree with their definition of essential equivalence, and do think that the Commission and the Department of Commerce should be commended for their work to try to negotiate the Privacy Shield. If there are still issues with it and unresolved questions, my request to everyone involved would be, let's not put artificial deadlines on the conversations. Some of these issues are difficult. Let's have them from a global perspective and understand how we enable the ethical and innovative data use of data with global data transfers.
All right, so we're going to start at that side of the table with Danny and just work our way down. Brief wrap-up thoughts on anything that's been on the table.
So all other than thank you, is next panel we should just talk about trust and power. That's the conversation. And I kind of mean that. We I think are sort of struggling to put together all kinds of different governance institutions to find some stabilizing relationships here. FISA was reasonably stable for a while. People didn't love it, but it sort of worked at the. Some people liked it. Some people, I don't know. But it was stable given the technology context and the industry context that it was in. It worked for a while. I think the same is true on the consumer privacy side. If you look around the country, there's an explosion of privacy governance discussion in the private sector and the public sector. You have states all over the place working on drone legislation, self-driving car legislation, IoT legislation, this, that, the other thing. So I think we're very early in this discussion of having to really deal with modern privacy questions. But I agree with Laura. It's about some combination of power and trust.
I would just say I'm encouraged that I think what I heard here today is that there's general agreement that it's important for us to pursue the ethical and innovative use of data. It's important for society. It's important for cybersecurity because it takes data to protect data. At Intel, we're going to keep furthering this concept of rethinking privacy by taking those 8 fair information practice principles and doing further work to describe within individual contexts like cybersecurity or like the Internet of Things, how we can use those principles to show that we can use data and protect privacy at the same time.
So I'd like to thank Hoover and Lawfare and CDT and Intel for the opportunity to have this conversation today. The final thought I would have on it is on this power and trust issue. So I went to school actually in Northern Ireland and then in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the UK for many years. I lived in Geneva. So I've had some experience on the European side, and it's always struck me that we have a difference, right? In America, we don't trust the government, and we do trust companies. In Europe, they trust the government, they don't trust companies. It's the opposite. And this has always struck me culturally. I had in my own kind of theoretical way tied it to World War I and World War II in the way in which the wars worked out on territory overseas versus how they worked out here in our founding versus the European history. I have various theories on why this is the case. But I do think this is where we're starting to see this really come into vivid relief in light of new technologies, that where European citizens are more likely to trust their government with data and be less trustful of industry, we are much less likely to trust our government and be more trustful of industry. And what I get from that is that there is a power-trust relationship on this side of the Atlantic, that those who are in a position to do you harm, we are less trustful of that. And the way we've dealt with that historically is by dividing up power and creating checks and balances. And what we've had now is the growth of this new institution, the corporate identity, and ways in which that's challenging our traditional concepts of what power we have to divide up and provide checks and balances on. And I think technology is now forcing that conversation about how far we will go in separating this new power center industry from this other power center that we have historically gone to great lengths to prevent from getting too much power over us.
So I'll give just sort of a brief.
Turn on your mic.
Oh, sorry. I'll sort of conclude with just a brief plea for the kind of thoughtful, rigorous discussion that we see here but don't necessarily see elsewhere in these conversations. So a plea to preserve nuance. For example, the nuance between the privacy values of a video of yourself in the shower versus the kind of computer you might be using, the kinds of machine protocols. So understanding the complexities of these issues and ensuring we're bringing the appropriate context. And also that nuance be preserved whenever we understand the difference in government functions. Our government does a great many things. One part of our government is this national security apparatus. One part of our government is this domestic law enforcement. One part of our government is regulatory and their interaction with corporations. Certainly the times in which those different elements touch one another, and certainly whenever they share our information, that's relevant and that's important. But I think that we will all be better served by a much more productive conversation if we can engage each of these things on their own terms.
And I want to thank you for coming. I learned a lot. One thing that I learned, that one takeaway that I have is that Europe really is pushing us to not so much look at the separateness between the government and the private sector. They are linking those two from a privacy perspective, saying that if information can easily be taken by this thing, the government, from this thing, the private sector, maybe we need to regulate what can get into the private sector better. They're forcing us to think about that. And I think it's a healthy thing to start thinking about.
On that very challenging note, I want to thank you all for coming. Please join us again next time. Please, if you're not on Hoover's Lawfare events list, please get on it. We do a fair number of these, and we do a lot of them here, and we'd love to see you at ones in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.